The rain hit the glass of the subway entrance with the insistence of someone who had waited too long. Droplets ran in thin rivers down the brim of a worn umbrella, and the cold had a way of biting through the cheap fabric of jackets. On the platform, the fluorescent lights hummed, and the air smelled of wet concrete and old coffee. And in the middle of that gray theater, a man's body folded as if a string had been cut. Rachel had her son's faded lunchbox under one arm and a knitted scarf tugged tight around her neck. She felt the platform tile underfoot slick and cold, and before she knew the reason, she was kneeling beside him, hands finding the rhythm of a lesson she had promised herself she would never forget. His face was pale, his breath a rattle that did not belong to the busy city. People hurried past, umbrellas like a moving forest of indifference, until a young woman named Priya stopped. Then Tom, the bus driver who was always late, put down his paper cup and watched with a strange softness. Rachel looked up at the man she later learned was David Carter, CEO of a firm she had seen in glossy profiles and business roundtables. She did not think of titles. She thought of the small voice that lived at home that night, the one that asked if she would come back from the grocery store. The action was simple and ancient. She cleared his airway, pressed where a video at the community center taught her to press, counted aloud so her hands did not falter, and then pulled a blanket from her bag that her neighbor Helen had handed her on a winter morning. He coughed once, eyes blinking slow like a sunrise, and Rachel felt the wetness at her own temples from rain or relief, she could not say which. She handed him the scarf, as if returning a thing he did not know he had lost. Nobody in that crowded, noisy station could have guessed how the moment would stretch into months of consequence. What happens when the person you save turns out to be someone the whole city knows only by photographs and speeches? This is a story about a small mother with a bigger promise, about an act that reopened doors she thought forever closed. Let us go back a little before the rain. Rachel's apartment was on the third floor of a narrow brick building on Willow Street that smelled of lemon polish and old books. The radiator clanked like a complaining clock, and the steps outside always carried the echo of a neighbor's late-night laughter. She worked 2 jobs. In the mornings, she stocked shelves at Green Market with a yellow vest and a scuffed name tag that read R. Alvarez. In the evenings, she cleaned the conference rooms of the consulting firm where a younger version of David Carter sometimes ate hurried sandwiches. Days began with the sound of Marcus's breath through the baby monitor, with the warmth of his small hand curled into the crook of her finger, and they ended with the rustle of bills being sorted on the kitchen table under a lamp that hummed. The pocket of her scarf held a folded note from her mother, Lucia, telling her to breathe, and a photograph of Marcus in a superhero cape made from an old curtain. Maria, the superintendent, left a pot of soup on Rachel's doorstep some Sundays. There were names that kept her steady like rope. Helen, who lent her the blanket the night the heater went out. Jamal, coordinator at the neighborhood center, who press-ganged her into a first aid class with a promise of pizza. Priya, who ran the daycare and exchanged shifts. Officer Lee, who once rescued Marcus's kitten from a storm drain. Nurse Angela, who taught the class how to compress without breaking. Each person had a small role in the book of her days, and each role had a face and a taste and a sound. She kept a ledger where she tracked shifts, and on the margins she wrote one word often: promise. The promise was not for fame. It was for a life where rent could be paid on time, where Marcus could stop waking up from bad dreams. Rachel had joined the first aid class on a whim after Jamal insisted, saying it might help in the event of an accident, and she had stayed because it felt like armor. She learned chest compressions and how to call clearly for help, how to speak to strangers who were suddenly not strangers anymore. The skills came from a community that believed in passing on the small, necessary knowledge that builds quiet resilience. She never imagined one of those nights would require her to use everything she had practiced. When David opened his eyes, the station echoed with a dozen small sounds. The soft murmur of Priya saying, "Is he breathing for real?" The click of Tom's shoes on tile. The metallic clink of a passerby's umbrella chain. He tried to sit up, disoriented, and Rachel placed a steady hand on his shoulder. He tasted like pennies and corporate luncheon mints.
He croaked, "Who are you?" and the word came out thin. Rachel said, "My name is Rachel. I have a small son named Marcus. You are going to be okay." David tried to smile, the kind he used in photos, but his mouth felt like the inside of a glove, numb and clumsy. Priya took off her scarf and wrapped it around his neck like a parent covering a child, and Tom called emergency services, his voice a soft bark. "Station 12, we need help on platform 4, possible collapse." A woman named Ellen, who ran the bakery across the street, pressed a paper cup with hot tea into Rachel's hands and said, "You did good, love." David's breathing steadied. When
The paramedics came, because Rachel had not let her hands stop until they arrived. One of them, Nurse Angela, who later said she recognized the compression technique, gripped Rachel's arm with a gratitude that had weight. David clutched the photograph shoved into his suit pocket. It was a tiny thing, a flyer from a community event he thought he had never attended. Someone on the platform produced a crumpled napkin with a child's drawing on it, a scribbled sun, and big letters that said, "Thank you," which Marcus had given Rachel earlier that morning. David's immediate reaction was a fog of embarrassment and curiosity. He spoke with difficulty, asking soft, half-joking questions as the EMTs worked. "Who taught you? How did you know?" Rachel answered with a tired laugh and a simple truth. "I took a class at the community center." Jamal, who arrived and held back the crowd, explained that Rachel was the one who had run the drills. The CEO listened with that attentive calm that made cameras forgive everything, and when he finally managed a name of his own, he said, "I thought such things were for other people." That line hung in the cold, wet air like an accusation against the entire system. In the days that followed, David could not shake the image of Rachel bent over him on cold tile, the smell of wet wool and lemon polish in her hair. He is the kind of man who lived out of carry-on bags and calendars, a cleanly pressed map of obligations. His office at Carter & Vale shimmered with glass and polished chrome, and his assistants managed time like currency. But beneath the tailored shirts and confident speeches, there had been an afternoon years ago when a single community grant from his company had sent a truck of supplies to a program on the East Side, and his signature was on a letter that had once made its way to a small young mother named Rachel. He did not remember the faces, only the fact of the action, an item on a ledger. When he recovered enough to agree to coffee, he asked to meet her not because PR said it would be neat, but because something in the way she thanked him felt fiercely private. They sat in a small diner where the coffee tasted like it always did, bitter and honest. David folded his hands and said, "I am sorry I did not notice before." Rachel folded her own fingers around a mug and felt the heat sink into her palms. She answered, "You did notice once. You wrote a check. You changed a name on a list. That was enough then. I learned to keep moving." He looked at Marcus's drawing that sat between them like a talisman and said, "What do you want?" She blinked, surprised by the bluntness. She did not want a handout. She wanted the promise of stability. She wanted a small contract to cater an event. She wanted the dignity of being chosen for what she could do. The conversation stretched with hesitations and small jokes and 8 precise exchanges where each question met a pause and each answer landed like a stone on a pond. David asked about hours. She responded with preparations. He asked about references. She named Helen and Jamal and Tom. He hesitated and mentioned budget constraints. Rachel suggested a pilot for one event. David promised to think. Priya called to confirm a date, and Nurse Angela texted a thumbs up. The offer, when it came, was quiet and practical. A one-time contract, $500, and an invitation to apply for a vendor spot at a corporate holiday party. Rachel hesitated because pride and practicality wore with tired shoulders. She said, "I cannot promise I will not mess up." David replied, "None of us can. Try." The silence that followed felt like a small surrender. The acceptance was cautious and the transformation was incremental. Rachel turned a sparse kitchen table into a production line between shifts. Marcus drew menus in marker and attached smiley faces to napkins. Helen babysat on Thursdays. Jamal offered storage space in the center at a reduced rate. Priya helped with packaging. Tom, the bus driver, promised to deliver trays for free. Slowly,
$500 snowballed into a string of orders. David kept his word. Someone in procurement named Ellen, who managed catering relationships for the firm, put Rachel on a small roster. The first event was a nervous blur. Steaming trays, missing spoons, too little salt, a burst of laughter when a colleague named Simon praised a rice dish and then insisted it was his new favorite. Rachel learned to buy in bulk, to count napkins like currency, to time the oven like a conductor. As weeks turned into months, the company's annual charity program expanded to include a mentorship track that Rachel joined. She met more names: Coach Marisol, who taught budgeting; Professor Alvarez from the community college, who led a class on food safety; and CEO's assistant Claire, who began to check in with a text that said, "How are you this week?" There were moments of friction. A vendor named Kyle complained about delivery times. A city inspector found a missing permit, and fine threatened the fledgling business. In those tense episodes, Rachel found herself relying on the network that had first taught her compressions on cold tile. Jamal negotiated with the inspector. Helen covered a shift. Priya kept the phones on while she repaired paperwork. Each small victory collected like coins in a jar labeled hope. The neighborhood noticed. Maria at the laundry began recommending Rachel's empanadas. Marcus started bringing friends home from school with sticky cheeks and bright eyes. And the supper table, once a place of quiet accounting, became a noisy testament to the fact that people were eating together again. There were 3 moments that could have broken everything, and instead became turning points because people acted, hesitated, then acted again. The first was when a city health inspector flagged them, and Rachel sat at the counter and listened as he read the citation in a voice that made the letters heavier than they were. She thought of rent that week and how Marcus asked if they would have lights. In that moment, she remembered Jamal's advice: show them your ledger, show them your training. She produced receipts, a class certificate from Nurse Angela, and Helen's written statement about workspace sharing. The inspector, a man named Victor, whose granddaughter used to come to the center, softened when Rachel offered him empanadas and explained the steps she'd already taken. The second came when a bulk supplier messed up an order the night before a big corporate lunch, and David stood in the kitchen looking at trays half filled. He could have dispatched another vendor. Instead, he rolled up his sleeves and said, "How can I help?" And for the next hour, he and Rachel plated salads and filled cups, their hands moving with a surprising harmony. They exchanged stories in 6 quick back-and-forths about childhood meals, about Marcus's favorite dessert, about why people cook for others. The third was when an online post misrepresented the relationship between a charity donation and Rachel's business, hinting at favoritism. Comments piled up, some cruel, some curious. She almost shut down. Claire, Ellen, Tom, Jamal, Priya, and Helen flooded the comments with truth, with receipts, and with photos of Marcus on delivery routes, and the tide turned. Those episodes, each 5 to 6 paragraphs long in her head, tightened her resolve and widened the circle of people willing to stand beside her. 1 month later, the company's internal newsletter ran a short piece about the platform incident and the newcomer who had saved a life. It did not mention titles in the way that mattered. It mentioned a mother, a child's drawing, and neighbors who had passed on a blanket. Marcus's drawing was framed in David's office by the window where sunlight now hit the corner like a blessing. Rachel used the small contract to stabilize rent and bought a new set of pans. The community center, under Jamal's stewardship, launched a first aid scholarship in her name, and Nurse Angela led the first quarterly class. Helen and Maria were first to congratulate her at a modest ribbon cutting where Ellen supplied pastry and Tom drove a van with a homemade banner. People began to ask for catering for community meetings, then for local weddings. Rachel took a certification course that the city sponsored because David pushed his contacts at the Chamber of Commerce to support small vendors. Marcus's teacher, Mrs. Barros, sent a photograph of him holding a certificate at school for his punctuality, and Rachel cried when she read the note that came with a new pantry donation from Pastor Miguel. The small business that began with $500 grew into a micro-enterprise that trained others in food handling,
creating work for Priya and for a young man named Kyle who returned to apologize and then stayed to learn. The names proliferated, and each name carried a memory of a hand held out in a time of need. 3 months after that rainy morning, the company's corporate social responsibility fund created a pilot program that prioritized vendors from underrepresented neighborhoods. Rachel was on the panel that advised the selection committee. She spoke in a low voice about dignity and what it meant to be chosen for competence. Claire introduced her as someone who had saved a life on a subway platform, and when she laughed nervously and Marcus waved from the audience, there was a standing ovation from colleagues who had once only seen each other in glass-walled meetings. David arranged a small scholarship in Marcus's name for the neighborhood's after-school program and personally mentored Rachel on scaling a menu without losing the recipes passed down from Lucia, her mother. The mentorship was not one way. David learned to look at profit and possibility differently. He visited the community center, listened to Jamal, and publicly acknowledged the blind spots of his earlier philanthropy. Ellen taught Rachel to manage larger event logistics. Marisol helped design a rudimentary accounting system. With those changes, the village around Rachel moved from support to partnership. 6 months later, the transformation showed in concrete ways that were almost visible from the street. Rachel's kitchen had a small sign that read Alvarez Catering, with a hand-drawn sun as its logo. Marcus had a scholarship that covered most of his after-school costs. He had an aquarium at home and a list of new friends whose parents had found work through Rachel's catering. Jamal reported an uptick in center attendance, citing the scholarship and the first aid classes as reasons families felt safer. Officer Lee arranged a safety workshop for local businesses and credited the collaboration for reducing petty theft in the block. The company documented an increase in vendor diversity and published a short case study that introduced readers to Helen, Maria, Claire, and Coach Marisol. The community organized a small monthly market where local vendors sold food and crafts. Rachel's booth often had the longest line. People took pictures next to the framed copy of Marcus's drawing that hung in the market's common area, and they told stories about the night raining like knives when a mother knelt on cold tile and refused to let a stranger go. The scarf that Rachel had lent in that moment was now carefully stored in a small wooden box at the community center with a plaque that read, "For warmth and courage." It was not a trophy. It was a reminder of what an ordinary object could do when passed between hands that intended care. The city, which had once treated neighborhoods as lists and numbers, began to see them as networks of resilience. The final scene returned to a subway platform nearly a year later. This time, the rain came as a soft lullaby, and David, now a friend rather than a distant executive in a suite, stood beside Rachel and Marcus. He smiled at the boy who had learned to carry a lunchbox like a treasure chest, and at Rachel who had come a long way from counting shifts at the market. They met Priya and Jamal and Helen there, and they watched as a stranger slipped a sweater over the shoulders of a shivering commuter. David put his hand lightly on Rachel's back and said, "You gave me the chance to see." She looked at him and, with a tired and honest voice, said, "You helped me keep one promise." The gesture was small. People recorded a short video that later circulated as inspiration, but what mattered was not the video. It was the fact that a series of ordinary decisions had braided into something that sustained more than one household. If this story touched you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that one small, careless-seeming act can open a door for many. Subscribe to hear more stories that show how everyday courage and community care rebuild lives, and maybe, if you can, find one small thing to offer your neighbor today, whether it is time, a skill, or simply a listening ear. Sometimes, the world heals from the places we least expect, and often it starts with what we have to give away.